All right, good afternoon. I'm going to call to order this regular meeting of the Public Safety, Civil Rights, and Emergency Management Committee meeting. Today is May 20th, 2015. I am Councilmember Blong Yang, chair of this committee. With me today are the following committee members: Councilmember Palmisano, Councilmember Gordon, Councilmember Warsami, and Council President Johnson. We are a quorum of this committee, and so we can conduct the business of this committee. Today we have 4 items on the agenda, and we will take care of some items first, and we'll get to the public hearing last. So the first items are the public hearing items related to the repeal of the spitting, depositing tobacco ordinance, and the repeal of the lurking ordinance. We will hear both of them as one. The third item is a consent item, and it's with regards to hats, conduct in theaters, repealing the ordinance. And this is referring to staff the subject matter of an ordinance amending Title 15, Chapter 385 of the Minneapolis Code of Ordinances relating to offenses miscellaneous in general, repealing Section 385.70 entitled Hats, Conduct in Theaters. And this was introduced by Councilmember Andrew Johnson. The fourth item is a report from the Department of Civil Rights Police Conduct Oversight Commission on police investigatory stops, and we'll get a report from them. And this would be a discussion item, and this will happen right before the public hearing. So with that, I will address the first item, which is a consent item, and I will move for approval of that item. Any discussion? And this is just referring it to staff. Okay, hearing no discussion. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? The motion carries. Okay, the second item on our agenda is receiving a report from the Department of Civil Rights Police Conduct Oversight Commission. And, with regards to this matter, we have put 20 minutes into this. And so if you can stay within that time, we will cut you off if you go over. Okay. Thank you. All right, Mr. Brown, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members. My name is Michael Brown, and I'm the director of the Office of Police Conduct Review. And I just wanted to give a little bit of an outline as to what you can expect from this presentation. 172.10.2 states that the purpose of the Police Conduct Oversight System, one of the purposes is to provide the public with meaningful participatory oversight of the police and their interactions with the citizenry. That is one of the things that has been a particular goal of ours when we set up and got the commission working. The commission is actually governed by 172.80, and it's under the provisions and the authority under 172.80F that we are here before this committee today. That's the authorization to conduct a program of research and study, and then also to present those results to the Public Safety Committee. There are 3 just quick takeaways that I'd like to just bring to your attention about this particular report. One is that this report, I think, will lend some information that's relevant to the discussion you're having about the ordinance and its consideration to keep or repeal it. It's also part of the national discussion about investigative detentions of low-level offenses. And this specifically is looking at a gap area. The council had originally asked for some information from the police department and the city attorney's office on this issue, and this is going to look specifically at a very narrow piece of that, which is the voluntary versus the mandatory requirement for those documentations. And that's an issue that the commission identified and looked at specifically with a review of the audit of its cases. The third takeaway item, one of the other takeaway items, is the idea of the reports and the documentation of those interactions that citizens and police have, and the requirements and mechanisms we have for documentation. And then lastly, I just wanted to bring to the attention that the commission is now very well suited to handle these kinds of matters, and that other issues may arise out of the commission's work as well. So I just wanted to bring those three items to your attention. So the presenters that we have today, there are two. The first presenter is Ryan Patrick. Ryan Patrick is the legal analyst for the Office of Police Conduct Review. Now, Ryan has been with the organization since the change over to the Office of Police Conduct Review. He was also with us when it was Civilian Police Review Authority. Ryan has looked at well over 1,000 complaints in his capacity, originally as the intake investigator, but as we were doing more work with the commission, we really shifted some of those responsibilities away from Ryan so he would be able to do some of the more analytical work. And so he will come forward and talk to us about that, but I just want to tell you a little bit about him. He's a graduate of the University of Minnesota Law School. He graduated magna cum laude from that school. He also has a bachelor's degree in sociology and criminology from the University of Illinois in Chicago. He also graduated from that institution, magna cum laude as well. Part of the reason why in the second year report that we made a request for 2 additional investigators is part of what you're going to be seeing now with the presentation from Ryan, which is the shift in some of the work. And that's the reason why one of the reasons why we've asked for those 2 additional investigator positions. The other presenter is Jennifer Singleton. She is a commissioner on the Police Conduct Oversight Commission and also the vice chair of that commission as recent of this year. She has served on the PCOC since its inception and has served on every committee that we've had. She's currently the chair of the Outreach Committee and has served as the chair of that committee the entire time, and she has spearheaded a number of different issues, not only outreach and engagement, community engagement meetings, but also some of the hearings that the Police Conduct Oversight Commission has had. Just by way of background, she is also previously a litigator. She currently works with the Legal Services State Support, where she's providing training and assistance to legal aid attorneys, pro bono attorneys, and pro se individuals. She's also a graduate from the University of Minnesota Law School, also magna cum laude. She was the editor of the Journal of Law and Inequity and the director of the Immigration and Human Rights Clinic. She has a bachelor's degree from Macalester College, where she had a major in sociology and a minor in psychology. So those are the individuals who will be presenting. I want to just thank the committee for, particularly Councilmember Gordon and the chair for inviting the commission to come and present the results of their work. They've been working very long and hard on this report, and I think you will find this report to be very informative. Thank you.
Chair Yang, Council, thank you for having us. I'm here today to present on the results of the investigatory detention documentation. So I'm going to delve right in. This study was enacted by motion at the March 10, 2015 meeting of the Police Conduct Oversight Commission with the goal of looking into practices in recording and reporting suspicious person stops, including variables such as the grounds for such stops, demographic information of those stops, and the location of stops. This study, I'm not going to read all this, went on over a very long period of time where it was being developed in combination with police presenters. I draw your attention to the October 28, 2014 meeting where sergeants from and a lieutenant from the MPD training unit came to give a presentation and inform the commissioners about that. That's going to come up again a little bit later in this report. A very broad look at Terry. These stops are based on the case law established in Terry v. Ohio, a 1968 case from the Supreme Court, stating that an officer must be able to articulate reasonable suspicion to perform a certain type of investigative detention. They have to have reasonable suspicion that a crime is being committed, about to be committed, or that the subject is armed. And it consists of a brief detention so that the officer can resolve suspicions, prevent future crimes, or stop any ongoing criminal activity. And the person is not free to leave during this type of stop. So this is from the MPD training unit actual presentation to the commission. And that's where the commission learned that the MPD, when talking about Terry stops and documenting them, records them as suspicious person and suspicious vehicle stops. They highlighted that the policy requires officers must be justified under the law in stopping and must be able to articulate the reason for stopping, but documentation should be made. It's not a requirement that officers document the reasons for the stops or the what occurred during the stop. And that's basically what the genesis of the study. So how did we do this? We took a simple random sample of 385 computer-aided dispatch records and also checked the CAPERS database to look at what was actually being documented in those stops. We excluded calls that led to booking and ones that originated from 911 calls. If it led to booking, there's a policy that requires an officer make documentation. And 911 calls already have the reason for the call built into them because the 911 caller is describing the incident. 385 incidences would ensure that we had a statistically reliable result. The variables we looked at: documentation, whether any documentation was made; outcome, so what occurred at the end of the stop; demographic information of those stopped; location; and duration information. Now, some of those icons are light and some are dark, and that's because the light icons indicate voluntary things that officers could document. The dark icons are largely picked up automatically when an officer generates the stop. And I just want to be clear that in this study, we were looking at whether documentation was occurring, not whether the stop was justified. So let's delve into the results. First and foremost, in looking at 385 stops, we found that 32% of the stops contained some documentation about why the person was stopped or what occurred during the stop. Our confidence interval, to be 95% certain that the true population is accurate, is about 27% to 36% of stops had some form of documentation. So about 70% of stops contain no information about what occurred during the stop. This slide is showing the outcomes of the stops, the automatically generated outcomes of the stops for the most frequent types of stops, most frequent outcomes. And right away we noticed something kind of glaring in that citations were overwhelmingly documented. There was documentation provided. So we looked into it and discovered that there is a policy. It's not in the same section describing the Terry stops, but there is a policy that requires documentation in that instance. So it didn't necessarily fall into the same criteria as the other stops we were looking at. But because we had a large enough sample, we were able to remove that and determine that when you remove that mandatory section, only about 26% of stops had documentation. So about 75% of stops had no information about what occurred. And just to be absolutely positive that we were looking at the right range where the actual number would lie if we looked at every stop, with a 99% confidence interval, we're looking at about 20% of stops with documentation and 32% of stops with documentation. So somewhere in that range. Here we're looking at precinct information. So out of the 385, where were these occurring? You can see that there's some variability. The second precinct, about half what occurs in the first, third, and fourth precinct, and the fifth precinct somewhere in the middle. But looking across all precincts, the level of documentation is pretty consistent. So all precincts are hovering right around that 30% number that we originally looked at. So this is a citywide issue. It's not limited to one precinct. And this is outcome information. And rather than looking at the specifics, what you can see is that the outcomes of these stops are pretty similar regardless of where they're occurring. So either people are being sent away from the situation, advised, being issued a citation. That's occurring at roughly the same rate across precincts. So the most frequent results of stops were advised and sent. So some were advised to stop doing what they're doing or sent, told to leave the area. 124 people were advised and almost 150 people were sent from the area. Those are by and large the most common results of the stops. And back to our documentation of those outcomes.
Mr. Patrick, can you wait a second? Councilmember Gordon?
Just so you could clarify, what's the AOK?
AOK, they're not all documented. If you actually look at, there's only about 15% of those have documentation on them. So it's not entirely clear what's happening in all of them. But the ones with documentation, it appeared that whatever led the officer to conduct the stop wasn't actually criminal activity. So it was some benign activity that may have appeared like criminal activity in the first place.
And that just means AOK, like okie dokie?
Everything's fine.
Everything's fine. Okay, thank you.
Okay, Mr. Patrick, I just want to tell you that your allotted time, you got about 7 more minutes, okay?
Certainly.
So I know you have another speaker that's coming up.
Yep, I'm almost done with the data portion of the presentation. So I just would like to point to a map of where these occurred. We have a heat map. You can look at these in more detail online. But what you're looking at is a comparison of our data to Part 1 crime enforcement from the Minneapolis Police Department. And what you'll see is actually the hotspots track very closely. And what that's showing is that our data is quite reliable. If we didn't have a random sample, they wouldn't track that accurately. When cases did have some documentation about the reason for the stop, loitering was the most common reason cited. But if you look at open canister, drunk, and likely public urination, the alcohol-related stops maybe make up the most frequent results. However, because only 26% of stops had documentation, it's pretty hard to conclude why people are being stopped. Duration information. Majority of the stops happened in under 10 minutes, but there were a number of stops that happened in under 2 minutes, yet had people's identifications being run, had outcomes. So it may be questionable that duration information is accurate because it's hard to imagine 3 people's identification being run and stopped and talked to happening in under a minute. And of 12 instances that lasted longer than 60 minutes, only 50% had documentation. And if you look at the spread, documentation is pretty inconsistent regardless of the duration of the stop. In looking at demographic information, about 62% of cases had demographic information. Only 11% had race information. And largely the demographic information came from running people's driver's licenses. And if you notice, on the Minnesota driver's license application, versus the Wisconsin application, race is listed on the Wisconsin but not on the Minnesota application. So race isn't actually in our database, so that's largely the reason why you don't see this being recorded in stops. Males were overwhelmingly stopped more than females. And in looking at age, you see quite a lot of variability. So there wasn't a consistent pattern amongst the ages of those being stopped. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jennifer Singleton, who's going to talk about the recommendations coming out of this report. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Yang, and thank you, council members, for allowing us to present the results of the study with you today. As Director Brown said, I'm the Vice Chair of the Police Conduct Oversight Commission, and I'll be sharing with you today the actions that the Commission recommends the Police Department take in response to the results of this study. The Commission has 5 key recommendations that it would like to see the Police Department take in order to make sure that its suspicious person stops are carried out in a manner that's both legally justified and non-discriminatory. And by implementing these recommendations, the Commission also believes that the Police Department will move towards its goals stated in the MPD 2.0 policy goals of increasing public trust, transparency, and accountability. So the Commission's first recommendation is that the Police Department resolve any barriers that might exist to full documentation of these suspicious person stops. Based on the evidence collected during the course of the study and based on the conversations that we had with the police department's training unit, there don't just appear to be any existing barriers, but to be on the safe side, we would like, as MPD implements these recommendations, we would like them to keep an eye out toward any barriers and work with the commission to make sure that those barriers are resolved. The commission's second recommendation is that the police department strengthen its data collection during suspicious person stops. As Mr. Patrick explained, currently under the MPD's policy, officers are advised but not required to document suspicious person stops. So our recommendation is that that should in the policy be changed to a must, so that officers are required to document the reasonable suspicion that forms the basis for the stop, as well as the outcome of the stop. And this is important given the Supreme Court's Terry v. Ohio jurisprudence. And in that jurisprudence, the Supreme Court has made clear that, and this is a quote, these stops constitute a serious intrusion upon the sanctity of the person, which may inflict great indignity and arouse strong resentment, and it is not to be undertaken lightly. So in light of the significance of these stops, it's important that the police department is writing down why the person is being stopped. And this also comes up in the cases that the commission sees, where somebody may believe that they've been unjustly stopped, but if there's no documentation of what happened during that stop, then it's very hard to figure out what exactly is happening and whether in fact there was legal justification. The commission's third recommendation is that the police department clarify the purpose of suspicious person stops. The only stops that should be coded as suspicious person stops are those that involve the officer's reasonable suspicion that a crime has or will occur. During the course of the study, we found examples of cases that didn't fall within that narrow purview of cases. So, for example, an officer providing assistance to someone should not be coded as a suspicious person stop. So MPD should provide further guidance to its officers to make sure that they're coding these stops correctly, and should also instruct officers that if they have a reasonable suspicion that is going to lead to one of these stops, that they enter that suspicion into the computer-aided dispatch system first, and then, where feasible, enter that first, and then initiate that stop. And in doing so, they will provide greater information to dispatch in case anything happens during the stop, so that backup can have more information about what's going on with the stop. The commission's fourth recommendation is that MPD capture demographic information for suspicious person stops. As Mr. Patrick said, especially race is not frequently collected. And by collecting the race, gender, and age of those who are being stopped, the Minneapolis Police Department has a really great opportunity here to take the lead in Minnesota. This also ties in very well with, I think, something that your committee has been very concerned with, and that the Minneapolis Police Department is already doing in its analysis of the role that race plays in low-level arrests. So the commission recommends that the police department begin to collect that type of data for suspicious person stops so that it can build upon the work that it's already doing to make sure that these types of stops are being carried out in a manner that is not discriminatory.
Ms. Singleton, if you can wrap it up.
Yep, thank you. The commission's final recommendation is that there be continuing study into this issue, and more specifically, that in 2 years, there be another study undertaken to track the effectiveness of implemented recommendation. This provides the police department with 1 year to get the recommendations implemented and officers fully trained, and then an additional year of data which can be analyzed. So if I could just make one concluding remark.
Please.
If you look at the study, in 2014, there were nearly 30,000 suspicious person stops. So this is one of the reasons that the commission tackled this issue, is because we want to make sure that these multiple stops and interactions between the police department and the community are being carried out in a way that can increase public trust and are documented as being legally justified, and also so that MPD can use that data to analyze the trends and make sure that these frequent interactions with the community are being carried out in a non-discriminatory manner.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilmember Palmisano?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a couple of questions for you.
Okay.
I was curious in clarifying the purpose of stops. So often, at least in my experience riding along with police, there are many reasons for a stop, or a stop might be for one reason and turns into a need for something else that they're serving. So when you suggest coding it, is it to only code one thing? Would it be some kind of method where you could put everything that you've, every service that an officer has perhaps done at that particular site? That's my first of two questions.
And I think my understanding of the system is that where something, where a stop was initiated as a suspicious person stop, that ended up turning into an arrest, then that would kind of be transformed into a separate batch of cases. We're just trying to weed out the cases that don't involve any suspicion of criminal activity. And that would certainly be something that the commission would want to work with the police department to make sure that there's clear guidance where there are multiple reasons for a stop, that all of the appropriate codes are being applied. Does that make sense?
Yep, thank you. The other question that I have is based on your recommendations. How would you suggest that we document race here? Is it something that you ask someone? Is it something that you make a guess at? Does it introduce a potentially difficult topic in an already difficult situation? What recommendations did your committee go to the point of having recommendations on how to collect that?
Our committee did not get to the point of having a clear recommendation for how exactly that would be carried out, and we want to work with the police department. I can say that personally, I think that it should depend on the purpose of collecting that data. I think that if we are working to spot trends that might indicate impartial policing, or partial policing, I should say, discriminatory policing, and that's based on an officer's perception, then I would think that the officer's perceived, the race that the officer perceives the person they're stopping to be may be important. However, I know that's tricky because a perceived race is not necessarily the race that a person identifies as, and so that could also be problematic. And it's tough since Minnesota doesn't include that information on identity cards. But I think that's something that needs to be worked out, and I think that it's worth having those conversations to collect that data because I think it is important to have that data.
Thank you.
Council President Johnson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This data that you collected or that was derived out, do we have any indication as to what percentage of the calls where someone would be stopped for suspicious person or suspicious activity is directed because of a call in a 911 call or just an observation by the police officer, perhaps, Mr. Ryan?
Yeah, and for this study, we weeded out calls that were not officer initiated. And
Were not officer initiated.
right,
So these are
somebody's-
911 calls.
right,
I'm
so
sorry.
no 911 calls. If somebody saw something they thought was suspicious and called it in, and then the officer responded, that was not included in our sample.
Okay, great. Thank you. I get it now. The other suggestion I have, and I come from this, 30,000 stops where we have almost 70% of the time we have the information not collected about, excuse me, not the information not collected, the information not documented about why the stop occurred. It just occurs to me at 30,000 times a year, this is going to take more police time. And so if we change the policy to make sure that documentation does occur, which I think is a reasonable thing to do, it certainly will need to include more police time. I just this morning hearing about a friend of mine who went on a ride along, and in the 4th precinct at least, the police officers that are on patrol, they go from call to call to call to call to call, and you wonder sometimes if they have time to take a break for dinner. But so I'm just saying that there would be, I think, cost involved in adding additional information to 30,000 of the calls of the 500,000 911 calls that happen every year. So
Yeah, and that is something that we've thought about. And when an officer initiates one of these stops, they do enter that, they do kind of log into the computer-aided dispatch system is our understanding. So it would just be typing in a couple brief statements. But I do understand the multiplicity effect.
Councilmember Gordon?
Thank you very much. And was it 30,000 suspicious stops?
Just under about 28,000 something. I can't remember the exact number.
That is quite a few. I just appreciate the report and sharing the information here at the committee. I'm a little bit curious about what happens with the recommendations. Is the police department following up on these recommendations, or are you making them to the council for us to follow up on? Because I'd like to see if we couldn't pursue some of them and move forward on the recommendations. So what's your understanding?
So we finalized the study at our last meeting, or at our April meeting, I should say. And after that, we forwarded a formal letter with the recommendations to the chief of police. So we will definitely be following up with that. And I think that it would also make sense for the city council to follow up as well.
And I'm not sure if we necessarily need a staff direction at our committee today. I hadn't thought about that beforehand, but that is something that we could do. I also wanted to let you and everybody else know, and I know you already know this and we've discussed this a little bit, but the council is also looking for a way to get better protocols about capturing this kind of information. And we passed a staff direction asking the attorney's office to work with the department to make recommendations about a clearer policy and protocols for recording and reporting demographic information, especially race and location of police stops that do not necessarily lead to an arrest. And we're expecting that report to come back the second quarter of this year, which could be very soon.
Mm-hmm.
So what I might like to do is kind of have these recommendations, and we'll see how much the chief is pursuing it and moving forward, but have them with us when we get that report back, so then we can use that as an opportunity to build on whatever the recommendations are from our staff and also the great work that you've done with the commission. So that's kind of my theory of how we can approach those without making a formal direction now, but we'll certainly be tracking that, and hopefully you'll be communicating with us too.
Great, thank you.
Council members, any other comments? Okay, hearing none, I will move to receive this report. Any discussion? None. Hearing none, I will, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? The motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so we're here for the main event now. I think most of the folks here are here for the public hearing. And, I'm just going to read some ground rules just to let you all know where we're at, and we'll kind of go from there. And then we'll shift some things, make some things work out. But, just work with us on this. So first and foremost, this is a public hearing process, and it will proceed as follows. We have sign-up sheets outside and also to the city clerk there. If you want to speak, please sign up. We will begin this in a different way, and we'll work that out in a little bit. But we're going to begin this with Council President Johnson has some remarks before she has to leave this meeting, and so we're going to allow that to happen. Let me just read a few things, and then I'm going to open it up to Council President Johnson. We will open the public hearing. Each speaker will be given 3 minutes, and we will continue until all speakers are allowed time to address the committee. Please, when you come up, state your name and your address for the record, your organization if you represent one, and whether you support or oppose the repeal of the ordinances. If you want to make written comments, feel free to do that. We have a sheet that will allow you to do that. But on top of that, you can send an email or you can do snail mail to us, the City Council. And this is the second part of the public hearing. Our first public hearing was on May the 6th. And then after Council President makes her comments or, whatever she has to say, then we will start the process. But before we start the process, though, we will have presentations from our Department of Health and also from the ACLU, and then we will begin the public hearing. So just to let you guys know, I also want to point this out just quickly. And I had said in the May 6th hearing that on the 20th, the police department and the city attorney's office would be presenting as well. That plan has changed, and if anything, I take full responsibility for that. But really, what my understanding is this: that all the information that they would have presented has been presented already by either myself or Councilmember Gordon, and so it would have been just repetitive, and that's why we took them off. But Department of Health and the ACLU, we will do the presentations, and after that, we will open up for public testimony. So hopefully that's clear. After the comments up here, then I will give some time for my enforcer here, Councilmember Palmisano, to read some additional rules, and then we'll continue with it. Okay, so just work with me. This is going to be fine. We're going to do this, but we're going to start with Council President Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I apologize that I have to leave early. I did watch the last public hearing, and I will listen via tape, via TV to the remarks that happened today, but I have to leave to go to the University of Minnesota Research and Outreach Center on Plymouth Avenue because they are renaming the center for Dr. Robert Jones this afternoon, who was one of the people that fought for that center. I really appreciate, I'm going to speak about spitting first, and I'm coming from this as a nurse. I've told some of my colleagues in my life as a nurse, I've dealt with multiple kinds of bodily fluids. And I think spitting is perhaps just, or sputum, we call it, is one of the ones that is the most challenging because it is other things. You wear gloves, that sort of thing. When someone spits on the sidewalk, children can walk through it. People have to be careful where they walk. But it is a human habit that happens all over, and many people do it. If I ever saw one of my children spitting in public, I'd send them to their room. But it is something that people do all the time. A man was jogging by my house the other morning and spit on the sidewalk in front of my house. So it isn't also one of the ordinances that we enforce vigorously. I looked at the police reports from the one spitting case that we had last year. And it was someone who was on Nicollet Mall and was obviously intoxicated and spit on the sidewalk. And so that person was eventually cited for spitting, but then taken to detox. So I think when you have a law in the books that is so sporadically enforced that it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to keep that on. And I kind of look at the rest of our agenda where Councilmember Johnson, the other Councilmember Johnson, is looking at repealing the section entitled Hats in Conduct in Theaters, that spitting may be one of the ones that goes the way of hats in theaters. So anyway, that to me is something that makes sense. And I'm going to listen to the public hearing testimony from today and make my decision when the council votes on this at the next council meeting. But I will tell you that from my own experience in the community that I represent, this lurking is a tool that the police use at times, I think, fairly effectively. And I represent the far northwest corner of Minneapolis. So my ward borders Brooklyn Center and Robbinsdale and Mississippi River, and then Lowry Avenue and down to Broadway a little bit. Just within the last 2 months, the police made an arrest of a group of people for lurking in one of my neighborhoods that they felt we had extra patrols out that night because there'd been 9 burglaries committed in a 2-block radius the night before. And so the police in the 4th precinct responded and put extra patrols out. And at 2:00 in the morning, they found a group of people, walking through the alleys in the neighborhood, looking in garages, that kind of thing. And so they were arrested for lurking. These were people that had long histories of burglary. It's 2:00 in the morning, and I think the police did the right thing in that case. So these are the kind of challenges that I think some neighborhoods, and not all neighborhoods in Minneapolis, face the same sort of challenges. In my own neighborhood, again, my own county commissioner was carjacked in his driveway by someone who was lurking in his alley. A month ago, we had a 90-some-year-old man who was assaulted in Crystal Lake Cemetery, visiting his wife's grave by someone who, if you look at the definition of lurking, he was lurking, waiting for someone to steal a wallet from. And so he stole this man's wallet and then assaulted him. A block away from me, one of my neighbors was carjacked in his driveway by someone who was lurking in his alley. They put him in the trunk of a car, drove him away into the neighboring neighborhood, Robbinsdale, and left him sitting in that car in 40 below weather. And thank goodness someone heard his screams and hollers and came out and rescued him. So I think as I look through the reports of 2014 of the lurking arrests that have been made in my north side neighborhoods, the three of them, I am convinced the police had adequate reason, and I think they took potential burglars off the street, potential robbers, and I appreciate their work. So that's where I'm coming from. But again, I'm going to listen to the information that's presented and then make my decision. I also just want to acknowledge that I have had contact with several constituents and people that I very much respect that are people of color in my community, and they have relayed experiences that they have had with police interactions in their neighborhoods that they live in, work in, have lived in for a very long time. And I think it is challenging for people of color, so I respect that people tell their experiences and talk about what they perceive as being perhaps unfair treatment by our police department. But I think if we have unfair treatment, it is something that needs to be addressed with individual officers or with supervisors, that sort of thing. But I want to acknowledge that people have called me about this and encouraged me to be supportive of repealing the ordinance. So I appreciate people's input. I will listen to what is said and make my decision. And I want to thank the chair. He had this, carried this public hearing on another committee meeting for me because I was gone last time. But I'll stay until I have to run to UROC and listen to folks. Thank you very much.
Council members, any other comments before we begin? Okay. I should have said this first. We have an overflow room in room 319. So if you're standing and you want a seat, please, 319. If you want to stand, feel free to stand. We also have some seats right up front. We're so far away, we can't spit at you, so you can certainly sit up front too, okay? I was not trying to be funny there. With that, I'm going to ask Councilmember Palmisano to say a few things because she's the enforcer for today. And once she does that, then we're going to open it up for Gretchen Musicant, and then we'll go with Bill Pinilovich right afterwards, Bill. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to just acknowledge that we've had a lot of thoughtful, passionate testimony at the previous previous part of this public hearing. In order for everyone to be heard in this conversation, we're going to need to manage the time allowed for each person. That's why you see the clock up there. If you spoke last time, we ask that you please excuse yourself from the queue at this time and speak at the end if there's time. That way everybody else who's been here will have a chance to be heard as well. 3 minutes is a long time. That's longer than we typically give. We usually have 2 minutes when there's a crowd of this size, but I think that will help everybody to say what they need to say. I understand this can be an emotional topic. I'm going to cut you off, and that's nothing personal, and it's not about whether or not, I agree with you or like your testimony, but I'm going to cut you off, and you are welcome to then submit the rest of it to the clerk and for the public record, and there's a lot of ways to email that information as well. So thank you. And with that, someone who I will not be using the time clock for is our city staff and our Director of Public Health, Gretchen Musicant.
Thank you. Good afternoon, members of the council, Mr. Chair. I had to do a little research looking into this, the spitting ordinance, because as Council President Johnson noted, it's not one that's used often, and in fact, it came onto the books in 1898 and then was amended in 1904. And it was at a time when there was a great deal of concern about tuberculosis in our community. So I looked to the Center for Disease Control to learn a little bit more about the connection between spitting and transmission of tuberculosis. Years ago, really, when tuberculosis emerged, we were just learning to understand what is infectious disease, how do we transmit things. There was a sense that it might be transmitted by spitting. However, the water droplets that are involved in spitting are too large to be inhaled, and we know that today. Spitting is no longer considered a means of transmitting tuberculosis bacteria to others. The CDC also examined that similar logic and applies that to pneumonia transmission as long as you're not spitting on someone. Another expert from Aberdeen University went even into more detail than perhaps you want to hear, but talked about how spit on the pavement could spread tuberculosis. He said it would require that the infectious agent tubercle bacillus dry out, but not in the sunlight, because if it's exposed to sunlight, it will be killed. The particle would then need to be blown into the air while the sample was still fresh and be inhaled directly into someone's lungs. Such a scenario is highly unlikely. And these days, tuberculosis is rare, and saliva is more likely to be washed away by rain or destroyed by the ultraviolet rays. Further, the Mayo Clinic said that although tuberculosis is contagious, it is not easy to catch. You're much more likely to get tuberculosis from someone you live with or work with than from a stranger. Most people with active TB who've had appropriate drug treatment for about 2 weeks are no longer contagious. So that's it for TB. There are other behaviors by individuals that are more infectious than spitting on the ground but are not illegal. For example, vomiting in public is a way to transmit norovirus, but we don't have a law about that. Coughing, sneezing, singing, and talking in public while ill will effectively transmit disease. Coughing and sneezing into your hand and not washing it and then passing out papers or shaking hands is also a very effective way to spread disease. In 2010, when we had an outbreak of H1N1, the strategies that we focused most on for decreasing transmission of the influenza virus were social distancing, encouraging people to be maybe 15 feet away from each other, and covering your cough or sneeze predominantly in your elbow. But we did not pass any laws at that time. So in conclusion, I think that spitting may make you feel sick to your stomach because it's an obnoxious behavior, perhaps, but it's unlikely to make you ill. I have heard from a number of folks, and I'm sure you have too, who are concerned about the repeal of this law and its impact on social norms, that it might encourage more spitting. So I did a little looking into how do we impact social norms. There are a number of behaviors that we might draw corollaries to, like brushing your teeth in the morning, or adopting a dress code, or staying in line to buy a movie ticket. These all are impacted by social norms, some of them by mass media campaigns or even education through our entertainment venues. Another way to influence social norms is to correct misperceptions that everyone else is doing it. And at times, laws and policy might be needed, but in most cases, they are not. Thank you. I'll stand for questions.
Thank you. Council members, any questions? Okay, seeing none, thank you, Ms. Musicand. I appreciate it. Mr. Pinilovich, please. And you have 10 minutes.
How many?
10.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman and council members. My name is Bill Pinilovich. I am born in Minneapolis and have lived in Minneapolis. I was raised in St. Paul, but lived here the last 40 years. I've been a trial lawyer at Maslin LLP in Minneapolis here for the last 41 years. And I'm currently the president of the board of directors of the American Civil Liberties Union of Minnesota. And I speak today in support of repeal of the ordinance. One of the features of this ordinance that is quite striking to me as a trial lawyer is that it contains no definition of the word lurking. Therefore, under Minnesota law, any dictionary definition of lurking could be used to justify its enforcement. And that means that if you happen to be sitting in a Starbucks on your laptop, looking at Amazon or eBay, contemplating buying something from somebody out of state and not paying sales tax, and then reading the reviews, but not posting anything on the site yourself, you are, under the definition of lurking in the dictionary, lurking, and under the definition of the statute, you are violating the ordinance because you are contemplating violating the law by failing to pay the sales tax. And that is literally a potential legal viable interpretation of the ordinance as it sits today. Now, the lurking ordinance that you have today, with a slight variation, was in existence in 1968 and went up to the Minnesota Supreme Court and was held to be constitutional at that time, largely on the strength of the fact that in the prior decade or two, the United States Supreme Court had rejected challenges to similar lurking laws. But as anybody who is familiar with constitutional law knows, constitutional law is not static. And in the last 47 years, there's been a lot of change in the way the Supreme Court of the United States interprets the Constitution. And there's at least two significant cases that have been decided by the United States Supreme Court since this ordinance was upheld that struck down very similar ordinances as unconstitutionally void for vagueness. One case was a case called Papa Cristo versus Jacksonville. It dealt with a statute that prohibited persons from wandering or strolling around from place to place without any lawful purpose or object. In other words, if you're just out for a walk, you could be arrested. A unanimous Supreme Court struck down this ordinance, and I want to read to you what the Supreme Court said. I'm quoting, "Those generally implicated by the imprecise terms of the ordinance, poor people, nonconformists, dissenters, idlers, may be required to comport themselves according to a lifestyle deemed appropriate by the Jacksonville police and the courts. Whereas here there are no standards governing the exercise of the discretion granted by the ordinance, the scheme permits and encourages arbitrary and discriminatory enforcement by local prosecuting officials against particular groups deemed to merit their displeasure. It results in a regime in which the poor and unpopular are permitted to stand on a public sidewalk only at the whim of a police officer." In other words, a unanimous U.S. Supreme Court was worried that vague laws like the one that we're considering here impermissibly give the police power to arrest someone just because they are poor or look undesirable in the eyes of the officer. Now, in a more recent case, Chicago versus Morales, the court dealt with the ordinance of the city of Chicago, which provided, and I quote, "Whenever a police officer observes a person whom he reasonably believes to be a criminal street gang member loitering in any public place with one or more persons, he shall order all such persons to disperse and remove themselves from the area." A majority of the U.S. Supreme Court held this ordinance violated the requirement, and I'm quoting, "that a legislature establish minimal guidelines to govern law enforcement. There are no such guidelines in the ordinance." And the court, and this is an opinion written by a Republican appointee, Justice Lewis Powell, went on to say, and I'm quoting, "It is difficult to imagine how any citizen of the city of Chicago, standing in a public place with a group of people, would know if he or she had an apparent purpose. If she were talking to another person, would she have an apparent purpose? If she were frequently checking her watch and looking expectantly down the street, would she have an apparent purpose?" The court went on in that case to distinguish the Chicago ordinance from laws that were upheld by other courts on the grounds that the conduct was criminalized only when there was an overt act or evidence of a specific criminal intent, two things that your ordinance here that you're considering does not include. Finally, in the Morales case, the Supreme Court determined that not only did the ordinance fail to provide the ordinary citizen of the city of Chicago with adequate notice of what conduct was prohibited, but it also failed to provide police officers with guidelines to tell them what was and wasn't permitted, thus giving them unfettered and impermissible discretion. In other words, what the Supreme Court said was that laws have to be clear enough and definite enough so that an ordinary person, not somebody who went to law school, not somebody who's managed to get elected to city council, but an ordinary person walking down the street, has specific guidance on what constitutes illegal behavior. And I think not only is it noteworthy that Morales was written by a Republican appointee to the Supreme Court, but the majority of justices who voted to overturn that ordinance were Republican appointees. Members of the council, the right to have definite ordinances dealing with subjects of this nature is not a partisan issue in a very partisan United States Supreme Court. They have no trouble agreeing that ordinances like this violate the Constitution. Ordinance 385.80 suffers from all of the constitutional infirmities described in the Papachristou and Morales cases. It is so vague that it allows police to sweep people who are vaguely undesirable off the street, even if there's no crime that they can be charged with. And as I mentioned, it doesn't define the term lurk. And the term lurk in modern dictionaries includes things like sitting in a Starbucks, looking at the internet, and contemplating not paying a sales tax. In fact, under Minneapolis' ordinance, which prohibits lurking in public or private places, you could be laying in your bed looking at your iPad, lurking on eBay, and violate the ordinance should a police officer decide to invade your bedroom and arrest you for it. Now, that may be an extreme example, but it tells you something about how vague this ordinance really is. Now, the MPD's own data analysis shows that between 2009 and 2014, at least 74% of lurking arrests were people of color, and only 24% of those arrested for lurking were white, in a city where 64% of the population is white. The ACLU of Minnesota did a similar study of Minneapolis figures for the years 2003 to 2007 and found that African Americans were 8 times more likely to be arrested for lurking than whites. Now, in a community in which there's already a great deal of mistrust and suspicion between many communities of color and law enforcement, and in which there is a demonstrable statistical disparity between how laws are enforced based upon the color of a person's skin. Having a law this vague and indefinite on the books, giving citizens inadequate notice of what is impermissible, and giving police officers who are just doing a job absolutely no guidelines as to how they should perform their job undermines our community. It doesn't enhance our community, and it violates the Constitution. It is the policy of the Board of Directors of the American Civil Liberties Union of Minnesota that this ordinance should be either repealed or otherwise removed as unconstitutionally vague. I thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. Any questions, council members? All right, thank you so much. Okay, we are going to start this public hearing now. And, again, I want to reiterate what Councilmember Palmisano said, which is, if you've spoken already at the May 6th public hearing, I would encourage you not to speak, but I'm not going to come out there and yank you. So we're just going to put it at that. And, we're going to start with this. And if I'm going to say this too, I mean, if I know that you spoke already and your name is signed up, I'm just going to skip over you and we'll come back to you at the end if you absolutely have to say something. Okay, but I mean, I certainly am not here to chill your speech. I just want to give everyone the opportunity to have a chance to speak. Okay. All right. So the first person on our list is Nancy Heitzig.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much. I'm Nancy Heitzig. I'm a longtime resident of Minneapolis, West Bank, Cedar Riverside. I'm representing myself today in desire for repeal of these ordinances. I'm also representing the Coalition for Critical Change. Minneapolis is a great city, and If we read news items about Minneapolis, we frequently see we're in the top rankings, co-ops, bike paths, green space, income, low unemployment rates, low poverty rates. And that's just part of the story of our national ranking. If you look at some other statistics, we turn up at the top of the nation in incredible racial disparities and access to educational opportunity. We run a school-to-prison pipeline in the city of Minneapolis that has gotten federal attention. We have racial disparities at all levels of corrections, including certainly arrest. And these low-level offenses are really part of that story, right? And the racial disparity that's revealed there. I would strongly urge repeal of these offenses for certainly all the reasons stated by the ACLU. I would like to add, too, that I'm sure before this day is over, well, we've sort of already heard it, but I'm sure we'll hear again some concerns about public safety and some concerns about livability. And I would just like to ask the question, livability for whom? The enforcement of these laws, here as elsewhere, really across the nation, is making life unlivable for our communities of color. The enforcement of these ordinances is in effect criminalizing communities of color and the poor. There's no evidence in the city of Minneapolis or anywhere across the nation that any sort of policing of low-level offenses, whether we call it broken windows, stop and frisk, quality of life policing, whatever we call it, there's no connection of that to public safety. The police have all kinds of tools at their disposal to arrest people if they're trespassing, if they're burglarizing, if they're, committing real crimes. Certainly, these offenses aren't necessary for them to do their job. So thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for encouraging a larger community conversation about new Jim Crow in the city of Minneapolis. And again, I urge repeal. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Heitzig. We need your address for the record, for the public record. Thanks.
511 20th Avenue South.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The next speaker, and I don't know if he spoke before, but Joseph Spangler.
Chair and committee members, my name is Joseph Spangler, living at 2920 15th Avenue South. Our area has, for over 25 years, been the center of drug dealings, prostitution, as well as other violent crimes. A city policy giving low priority of enforcement to drug and prostitution in the 1990s generally contributed to this situation. Only after the adoption of proactive policing and recognition of the value of the broken window concept has some control came. The repeal of the lurking ordinance may be of little significance to overall enforcement efforts. The repeal of other very useful ordinances such as loitering, trespassing, and littering, I fear, is next, and this will make a very negative impact. Regarding spitting, greater enforcement of the ordinance may be warranted. Tuberculosis is not under control as reported by the World Health Organization. Also, still by the World Health Organization, spitting with contaminants is a cause. In developing countries, and our city has a large number of residents and visitors from this area. In addition, prisons in the United States have ongoing tuberculosis problems. Millions were spent on the reconstruction of Lake Street. With custom sidewalks, property owners were assessed for the work and are being charged for upkeep. Spitting on the walkways is constant in our area, leaving dark spots everywhere. It is reported that causing the spots is the illegal drug chewed with spit called cock, also AKA getting high. Clean walkways that make shopping or just walking the area enjoyable is not possible at this time. The ability for police to use the no spit ordinance being increased may help in correcting the situation and be far more effective than proving that is being chewed is illegal. Law enforcement needs tools to do the work of keeping us safe, and us at all levels of the legal system as trained professionals. Prudence needs to be there for balance overall within budget and civil rights.
Thank you, Mr. Spangler.
Our next speaker is Kathy Jones. Thank you.
Good afternoon, council members. My name is Kathy Jones. I live at 4336 4th Avenue South, and I stand before you as a lifelong resident of Minneapolis. I currently also serve in a volunteer position as the second vice president of the Minneapolis branch of the NAACP. I took time off from work today as a letter carrier because I understand the importance of a community free of racial profiling. I'm asking you, council members, to repeal the spitting and lurking ordinances. This would be a step in the right direction to show that Black Lives Matter in Minneapolis. These ordinances are outdated and are used as a tool to racial profile. Folks, there's no crime in standing while being Black. We know that the spitting and lurking ordinances are also used as a sort of gateway to the criminal justice system. And guess what, folks? As stated earlier, there's no proof that this city is any safer than any other city in the country that doesn't have these ordinances. Council members, I don't want my family members or my community's family members being charged with these vague and petty ordinances. We have seen all too often these low-level racial profiling laws can lead to unnecessary deaths. They are simply just not worth having on the books. Council members, by voting to repeal these ordinances, I believe we can begin some sort of healing of the animosity between the police department and communities of color. Of course, this won't happen overnight, but this could be a major step and a major turning point for our city. Do the right thing and repeal spitting and lurking ordinances. Stop letting the police use this as an excuse to racial profile. Enough is enough. Let's make our gritty city a great place for all our residents. Thank you.
Thank you. Joshua Esme.
Thank you, Chairman Yang, council members. My name is Josh Esme. I'm an attorney at the Council on Crime and Justice. I'm the Director of Public Policy and Advocacy there. That's a nonprofit in Minneapolis at 822 South 3rd Street. And I hope to be able to lend a little bit of a practitioner's perspective today. My work at the council really focuses on helping people overcome what we call the collateral consequences of criminal records. And these are the barriers that exist in the real world and the legal world that keep people from working, keep people from obtaining safe housing, participating in their community, and on and on. And one of the ways that we do that at the council is by providing access to legal services. We put on free legal clinics multiple times a month. And at these legal clinics, I have the pleasure of being able to sit down with folks and really sort of explore how the presence of these records and the stigma attached to these records create these barriers. Folks come to me with questions about how these records are accessed in the first place, how data mining works, and how they can obtain remedies in the law, such as expungement. And one of the things that is very clear from these conversations is how even so-called low-level offenses, misdemeanor offenses like disorderly conduct, but also like lurking and spitting, really do cause significant barriers, devastating barriers to people in terms of obtaining those basic life necessities. At the Council on Crime and Justice a few years ago, we actually did a study to try to quantify the effect of these low-level offenses on folks' employability. And what we found was that even just an arrest for a disorderly conduct offense was what we used in our study, but that's similar in nature, I think, in a lot of ways to lurking. Even just an arrest record for that created a significant decrease in someone's likelihood of even getting a call back for a job. We also talked to employers as a part of that study and found that 70% of employers in the Twin Cities are using these background checks, usually contracting with data miners for those services, and these records are coming up in those background checks. And one of the things that employers said is, we had employers tell us that we believe in second chances, but just not at my company. Or we understand that misdemeanor arrests are less serious than felony arrests, but it's still a risk that we're not willing to take. So these collateral consequences are problematic enough, I think, when we're talking about crimes like theft, like assault, more traditional crimes. But the lurking and spitting ordinances subject people to these burdens and stigmas for vague and de minimis behavior, and that is profoundly unfair. And once you factor in the real costs then that enforcing these ordinances have on members of our community, I think it's clear that public safety is in fact undermined by enforcement of these offenses. These offenses reinforce burdens, unemployment, homelessness, poverty, all of which are far more devastating to public safety than, frankly, standing and spitting are. Thank you.
Right. Our next speaker is a distinguished guest. We're honored to have Representative Raymond Dean here.
Thank you, Chair Yang and council members. My name is Raymond Dean. I live at 1211 Upton Avenue North. And please bear with me. I'm a little bit sleep deprived. I've had a busy few days. So
thank you for that.
I'll be really brief. I think that this comes down to an issue of public trust. Currently, there is no public trust between many members in the community and the police department. And although you'll hear lots of reasons why we should keep this on the book and why we should take it off the book, it's really two sides of a coin. And I would contend that you as council members need to look at the third side of a coin. Most coins have depth to them, and there's a surface that goes all the way around the coin. And I think that that's where you'll find what you need to be doing here today. I would contend that the lurking law and spitting law does nothing to enhance public safety. And the core of what you do in many ways at the city is public safety. And quite frankly, I think it might also be the opposite. I think that having these ordinances, quite frankly, do worse to enhance public safety than actually doing that. There are much more effective tools that police members have to really address what's going on in our communities, and I would just support you in repealing this moving forward. I'm not going to eat up the rest of my time. I know that many of these great individuals out here will be able to tell you their personal story. I've never been stopped for spitting or lurking, and quite frankly, I don't expect that I ever would be. So thank you today.
Thank you. The next speaker is Maggie Ewing.
Hello, my name is Maggie Ewing. I live at 1862 26th Street East in East Phillips. I first just want to affirm that I agree that this is a racial justice issue that we're fundamentally talking about today. And then I wanted to respond specifically to the things that Council President Johnson said before she had to leave, because I know she'll be listening to this. It seemed like the first argument she made is that lurking is a useful tool being used by the police to prevent crime, based on her review of lurking arrests in her neighborhood. I want to say that any increase in police power and control will prevent some crimes. And whether something is a useful tool gets down to whether that tool does more harm than good and whether it distinguishes people who are actually doing something harmful from people that aren't. And I don't think lurking is such a tool. You need to look at all the effects of the law, not just look through and see, oh, look, these are the ways that it prevented crime. You need to look at all the other effects which people are bringing up today. Another thing is that if you only looked at the arrest, the records of arrests for lurking, that you're missing all the people that were stopped with lurking as a pretext. And that I assume we're going to hear today from a lot of people who've been stopped by the police a lot of times. And I wonder what it would be like for you or me, Council President Johnson, if when we were just daily walking our dog, going to the grocery store early in the morning or late at night, if we were just regularly expecting to be stopped by the police. It would probably stop crimes if they stopped people that looked like us on the regular, but it would do more harm than good. And the third thing is that you said that you think we should address unfair treatment at the level of individual officers. And I want to argue against that because we know that we all have unconscious bias against people of color and especially against Black people. Like, that's just documented by social scientists. Like, you can show a 5-year-old child a bunch of pictures of babies and they'll say all the bad stuff about the baby, the Black baby, and all the good stuff about the white baby, regardless of the race of the child. And we're all like that. And so having these vague laws that will necessarily be selectively enforced, it just empowers that unconscious bias that we all have. It's just like, here, unconscious bias, you run the show, because all of these judgments are being made based on what it seems like to a police officer instead of based on actual criteria. So I think lurking is the wrong tool to use to stop the crime in your neighborhood. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you. So, Ms. Ewing, I hope you don't take any offense to this. When you're making comments, please direct the comments to the chair. In this situation, I mean, the council member isn't here, and it's probably appropriate just to direct the comments to the chair. Okay, so please, for future reference, do that. Okay, thank you. The next speaker is Chuck Turchik.
Mr. Chair, committee members, Chuck Turchik, 2112 Portland. I know I'm probably in the minority, but I'm here to speak for retaining the 2 ordinances. I was persuaded by the testimony of Mike Maney from the Downtown Council and the chair of the Safe Zone Advisory Committee of the Minneapolis Downtown Improvement District. With respect to lurking, the problem is far more serious than even Mr. Maney described. The lurking law provides the police with a valuable tool for preventing more serious crime, but that works for ordinary street crime. The often more devastating white-collar crime is much harder to detect and prevent. We need tools to prevent those crimes too. How do we do that? Well, invariably, white-collar criminals wear suits and ties. So to give the police an additional tool to help them ferret out white-collar crime, I suggest that you either add to the lurking ordinance or create a new ordinance making it illegal to wear suits and ties. And it breaks my heart to say this, and I'm sure Mr. Maney would agree, but I believe we may well have a nest of white-collar criminals precisely in the area represented by the Downtown Council and the 120 blocks of the Downtown Improvement District. Police need this tool. Mr. Maney lives in Tonka Bay. You see far fewer suits and ties out there, and they have much less white-collar crime. We should learn from them. And by the way, I was pleasantly surprised to see that Tonka Bay, where Mr. Maney lives, even has a stronger lurking ordinance than ours. It includes lurking with the intent to do mischief, words we eliminated in 2005. And as a result, they may have far fewer mischievous people than we do. Again, we could learn something from them about livability and civility. But given Mr. Maney's concerns about livability and civility, I was surprised and disappointed that Tonka Bay has no spitting ordinance. Now, we've often heard the argument that having strong central cities contributes to the strength and vitality of the entire metropolitan region. So I would suggest that Minneapolis, by keeping its spitting ordinance, could serve as a model of how to create a more livable and civil community. And maybe, just like with tuberculosis, by contagion, this ordinance could spread to places like Tonka Bay and make them more livable too. So to serve as an example for other towns of how to become more livable and civil, we should retain the spitting ordinance. And to give police a necessary crime prevention tool, we should in fact expand the lurking ordinance to include a prohibition on wearing suits and ties, or maybe wearing a suit and a tie with the intent to do mischief, or maybe lurking in white-collar garb. I thank the Downtown Council and the Downtown Improvement District for helping me see the light. We should never forget those memorable words of the French Revolution: livability, civility, fraternity, or something like that. Thank you for your time, and I apologize to the committee members wearing suits and ties.
Thank you, Mr. Turchik. just because of that, I'm going to make a rule again, another rule. This is the Turchik rule. Please do everything possible not to refer to other folks specifically and personally. This is a public hearing. I mean, we're talking policy issues. Let's try to do what we can in that situation. If you're going to refer to somebody, refer to them maybe once, but you don't need to refer to them several times. And if you're going to refer to them, I mean, generally just the previous speaker would be helpful. So I appreciate that, but thank you so much for the testimony. And I skipped over someone, and I have the first name, but I don't have the last name that clear. Charles Cure or Care. And I'm sorry about that. The handwriting gets to me sometimes.
That's all right. You butchered my name, but I'll live. My name is actually Charles Kane, Mr. Chair. All right. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Charles Kane. I'm the founder and president of Brothers Empowered. We're a community-based organization that service men of color seeking permanent change in their lives, and also men of color ready to influence permanent change in their lives. I also currently sit as co-chair on the Minneapolis St. Paul My Brothers Keepers Executive Committee. I'm here today not to ramble about facts or data or anything of that nature. I'm here just to share my personal testimony as a citizen and resident of Minneapolis, the city of Minneapolis. I've been dedicated and devoted to my community and to creating change, influencing change within my community for over 10 years. I've worked with men of color, white men, all men within this city for the last 10 years. From chemical dependency to reentry to fathering, healthy active fathering, and etc. to domestic abuse. I have a background, yes I do, but it's been so long ago that I don't recognize or remember who that person was. And friends, family, and associates neither recognize who that person was any longer. I don't want to speak in detail of that person. The fact is, I am a new creation and a new man as of today where I stand. Now, I've experienced and I've been a victim of lurking a couple of times. And it sickens me because I know that I am far long away, 10 years plus away from a lifestyle even resembling to crime or any activities that is connected to crime. I share a brief story about how I went downtown for a friend's birthday. And you know how it is to find parking space. I ended up finding a spot, dark street.
Mr. Kane, I'm sorry, I need to interrupt. I also need your address for the record, but your time is up.
Okay. My time is what?
You're going to need to yield your time to him.
Can I continue on? I'll be very brief.
Mr.
Sir, can you mention your address for the record?
Yes.
And then when those folks are called, they can yield their time at that time. Okay. So if you can just give us your address, please.
1516 Urban Avenue North. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you. The next speaker is Bob Kroll. Okay, we'll skip over him. The next speaker is Dave Bicking.
Thank you. My name is Dave Bicking, 4200 Cedar Avenue South. There's been a lot of great statistics. One I haven't heard is from a report I saw, an old report about in 2007, where the lurking law was used 80% of the time against people of color. That's no surprise. But all but one of those people was homeless. So when we even see the statistics of a quarter of the people who are affected by this as white, I suspect that an awful lot of those people are homeless. This is discriminatory in a number of different ways. In addition to the other problems, we've seen that this law is very seldom successfully used in the sense that it leads to any prosecution or the consequences for a particular crime. Now, that's a tremendous waste of police officers' time and resources, unless that isn't really the intent here. And if the intent is to get certain people off the street, harass certain people, move them out of various areas like downtown, where the downtown council presides, if that is the intent, these laws have been really quite successful. Now, one of the problems with the lurking law is it's so hard to determine intent. But with years of data and years of discriminatory consequences, it isn't too hard to see a discriminatory intent behind this, either in the presence of the laws or particularly in their enforcement. So that is the real problem. And many people have pointed out, well, yeah, you can get rid of the law, but the real problem is the police. And that is also true. So I would argue for a slippery slope in this sense. So many people have come out, there's been so much passion around this, that I think you're on the right track. And I think there's some other laws that may not on their face be as ridiculous or unconstitutional as these, but which really bear looking at because of the discriminatory enforcement of those laws. And once we can get the police to enforce laws fairly, then maybe those laws are good to have on the books. But until then, I think there's some others to look at as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Janet Nye.
Hello, my name is Janet Nye, and I live at 2112 Portland Avenue in Minneapolis. I will be speaking in favor of repealing the spitting and lurking ordinance. First, I'd like to thank the lawyers who preceded me for clarifying the unconstitutionality of this ordinance. The issue of constitutionality must be front and center in this discussion. Nuisance laws have a long history, one particularly horrifying example being the jailing of black men in the post-Civil War era. Men were arrested, fined, and jailed, and when unable to pay the fines, were given jobs by the penal system to work off what they owed. Many died from doing onerous and dangerous jobs, and some from sheer exhaustion. Not only is this ordinance unconstitutional, its enforcement is unequal. You know, there's a lot of spitting going on downtown, witnessed by huge crowds of people on public property. It's major league spitting right down there at the Twin Stadium. Others before me have pointed out that Minneapolis could become another Ferguson. The riots in Ferguson were a recognition by the people of the economics of inequality. 1/4 of the income of Ferguson city government comes from fines and court fees. Here in Minneapolis, we lead the nation in racial disparities in jobs and incarceration rates, as has been already mentioned. We need to look at how this plays out and to move to an economy that supports equity. Repealing this ordinance would be a concrete way to back up the words of our civic leaders. Do we want Minneapolis to remain a city where lawsuits are the way to handle police profiling, misconduct, and brutality, as Council Chair Barbara Johnson has supported through the years? Or do we want to create a city where fairness reigns, a glorious city to hand down to future generations? Thank you.
Thank you. All right, the next speaker, it's hard to read the name, so I'm going to I'm going to say your address, and if you can stand up and present yourself, that would be wonderful. 1101 Grand Avenue, St. Paul NAACP Youth. Thank you. I apologize. I mean, the handwriting is really nice, but it's hard to read. Sorry.
That happens often. Thank you. Hello, thank you, Chair and committee members. My name is Shantae Douglas, and I live at 1108 Grand Avenue, that's St. Paul, Minnesota. And I do support the repeal of these ordinances. And I'm sure you all know the numbers of this situation in point, and the numbers don't lie. When the greater portion of the city is of European or Caucasian descent, but the majority of individuals that are impacted by this ordinance are of African American descent, it shows the true or hidden bias of the citizens that make preventive police calls or tips, and the bias and the fear of the police of people of color in general, especially that of the young and energetic Black man. The ideas that he is capable and that he is powerful is what is scary. I know that these ordinances are a direct hindrance to my brothers and sisters. And in the exception of cases that are within absolute reason, the perception of the officer that may have the individual in question may automatically be an implication of criminal intent. I also know that police do indeed have the final say if the individual is given more than a citation, but is searched and seized, which is an inadvertent violation of their Fourth Amendment. The police officers could simply suffice through their bias and their perception that the individual deemed suspicious is dangerous to themselves or others, likely to continue criminal conduct, which is assumed by the officer, or they will be viewed as unlikely to respond to a citation, a direct attack on poor people, and especially poor African-American young men that may just be living their life. I have a sign that says, like, we're just living. We're just living. I can't imagine, but I do have to imagine living in a world where I could be standing on my street where I live on Grand Avenue in front of a restaurant, and I could be approached by a police officer just because somebody in that restaurant is afraid. Why? Because I'm existing. And I find that's extremely problematic. So I do urge the repeal of these ordinances. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Anna Gambucci.
Hi, council members. My name is Anna Gambucci. I live at 2161 Dudley Avenue in St. Paul. I have also lived in Minneapolis, spent time in Minneapolis, and understand how influential Minneapolis law is for the entire Twin Cities. I want to say a couple of items. One, which is kind of an unusual thing to bring up, my family would never be subject to these rules. That piece isn't unusual, but my husband does geocaching. It's kind of a little new hobby where you use a GPS and you find little hidden things throughout the city and in rural areas. And he would be far more likely to actually look like he's lurking because he's like digging in bushes. And he has done this in Chicago. He has done this all over town. And there's clearly this code that officers have approached him and he says, I'm just geocaching. And there's like this, aha, and that would not happen elsewhere. And I want you to know that that lurking code would be with my husband, who is tall and white and clean cut and non-threatening to cops. And he has been approached many times. And in the geocaching community, they always tell their geocaching community, just tell the officers that you're geocaching and they'll leave you alone. So you can just see how clearly this law does not apply evenly. And it doesn't, let alone does it put my husband at a risk of being shot. And I think that you're seeing that there's a turning of a tide, that we're starting to realize that not just that white Americans who were previously completely ignorant about the two parallel universes, we're starting to see it clearly. And that at a very least, that there's constant low-level harassment for people of color and communities of color, at the very least. And this law, how can we reverse that in this nation, in this city that gets all these accolades about its standard of living? How can we start to level that playing field? What are the first things we need to do to start to recognize that we need to right this wrong of these totally separate universes that are not parallel at all. If I have another minute of time, I'd like to cede that to the gentleman who was speaking earlier.
Ms. Gambucci, there will be other folks who may cede their time. So if you don't mind, could I just ask you to help the viewing public understand what is geocaching? And
Sure.
if you can be quick, that'd be great.
Sure. So it's a little bit like treasure hunting using technology that was developed by the Army, where you find coordinates that are latitude and longitude. And so there are different puzzle caches or just specific caches. They're hidden often in little tiny containers, magnetic containers inside stop signs. So it really could look like a drug transaction anytime that anyone is looking for this. And they're often using their cell phone as the GPS device or an actual GPS device you would buy from a sports store.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, the next speaker is Johannes De La Fonte.
Good afternoon, committee. My name is Johannes Wiedmelm Delfont. I work at the Public Defender's Office, and I'm here representing Mabel. My address is 2840 15th Avenue South, Minneapolis. Most of what I had prepared, I drafted the letter on behalf of Mabel, which the council should have received. That was signed by a few other organizations in the support of repealing this ordinance.
Can you just explain to us what Mabel is?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Just for the viewing public.
Yeah. The Minnesota Association of Black Lawyers. Most of what I was going to say has already been said today, but just from the perspective of a lawyer, my job is to make sure that justice is done every day. And these ordinances are not justice. The Supreme Court has held that the subjective intent of the officer in stopping someone, in other words, whether they stop someone as a pretext based on their bias or anything, that may be lawful, but that's not justice. And what we want is we do want there to be efficient policing, but we also want there to be fairness for the individuals that are stopped. And I wanted to address some of the concerns that I heard during this hearing, which is that lurking is essentially a means to prevent unlawful activity, and it's useful in the hands of the police officers. I'm of the opinion that anytime an actual crime has been committed, there are other means to stop that person. And in fact, if a police officer thinks that someone is suspicious, they have the right to approach them and ask them questions, and at that time either decide that they are up to something illegal or to let that person go. But the Constitution gives people certain rights, and the Constitution is meant to protect individuals from unreasonable stops of this nature. I had one case that the individual stopped for lurking, had to come to court several times before the case was eventually dismissed. Why? Because the city could not prove their case because he was stopped for basically no reason other than the cops' suspicion and a few other circumstances that made them think that he was going into cars or something of that nature. But really, he was just walking down an alley. And it should go without saying that he was a black man in his 30s. For this reason, I support the repeal. And the last thing I wanted to say was just that the recommendations that police should have to document their stops more, I'm very much in that favor. And there was a concern that it would take more time on the police. If you want to come down to the courthouse any day of the week, I will tell you it is the most inefficient system that you have ever seen. And what we're essentially saying when we're upholding these ordinances is that we're not putting any sort of priority on the time of the people who are stopped or that have to come to court, and certainly not the people who are actually booked for cases that are eventually dismissed, have to miss work. Sometimes they lose their jobs. And what we're essentially saying is that because you may have committed a crime, we're going to put a priority of that. We're going to prioritize that over the fact that you have to land in jail. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mike Griffin.
Hey, I am Mike Griffin. I'm at 7 Barton Avenue Southeast. I live in Ward 2. I'm the field director here with Neighborhoods Organizing for Change, that's NOC. I live in Ward 2, but I work in North Minneapolis. One of my good friends, Ryan Kennedy, is actually the executive director of MPIRG, whose office is also in Ward 2, right on University Avenue. Well, I'm usually there at MPIRG. There's usually college students who are out smoking cigarettes, spitting on the sidewalk, talking, lurking, if you will. But then when I get in my car, I would drive to North Minneapolis, where we have canvassers that would go out, who would be standing outside, maybe barbecuing, maybe smoking a cigar, going through their shifts, and they will be constantly stopped by the Minneapolis Police Department. But my ask to you, City Council, is that you respect me not only when I'm at home in Ward 2 or when I'm visiting MPIRG, but also when I'm at work in Ward 5 on Broadway Avenue. My equal protection under the law is not just on University Avenue in Southeast, but also on Broadway Avenue in North Minneapolis. I know there's going to be a lot of people here who are going to talk, who are going to have stories about them being stopped for lurking and spitting. I stand for you to repeal this law this year. Thank you so much for having my time. I will give it back to whoever else here.
You know, I don't see Mr. Kane anymore, so are you ceding your time to anybody?
Yes, whoever needs it in support of repealing can take the rest of my
We're
2.5
going to jump over
minutes.
that, but thank you, Mr. Griffin. The next speaker is Mel Reeves.
Good afternoon. My name is Mel Reeves. I'm at 1041 James Avenue North in Minneapolis. You know, I agree. There really is too much lurking and spitting going on. I mean, there's way too much lurking and spitting going on in Minneapolis. Too much lurking by the Minneapolis police with the intent to harass and arrest black folks. The truth is that this lurking disenfranchises too many of my neighbors. Too many of my neighbors, as a result of this kind of lurking, wind up caught, as the lawyer said, caught up in our legal system unnecessarily. And they can't get jobs, some can't get housing, and until recently, they couldn't even vote. So I agree there's too much spitting going on. There's too much spitting on the behalf of the Minneapolis cops in the face of our Constitution. There's too much spitting on the rights of my fellow citizens going on. And I understand that this law, this ordinance might be legal, but it's not right. You know, it might be lawful, but it's not right. It might be what's on the books, but it ain't right. And so I'm here because we have a new administration, a new sheriff in town, and all I hear all the time, and I'm not necessarily aiming at you guys, is that we want an equitable and just Minneapolis. We want an equitable and just Minneapolis. Well, I'm old school. So I know that, you know, I don't really watch people's mouths. I watch their feet because that tells me what they're really going to do. And I also know that all the good intentions in the world don't mean anything. There's old saying that good intentions do what? Pave the road to hell. And so we've got a lot of good intentions, and it's time that we put the good intentions to use. It's not going to do us any good to say, oh, we would like for more black people to have more jobs around here. We would like for black people to be harassed less. We would like for this to happen. It's time that we put our mouths. It's time that we actually practically apply some of this stuff. Cam, I'm glad that you had a community meeting around this. I'm glad that you all took this up, but let's do it. I mean, because it's not enough to keep saying, well, the problem in policing is we have good cops and bad cops. Well, if you have bad cops, right, if that's the problem, then what do? You get rid of the bad cops, right? If we know that these young people are being harassed, there's no need to sit around and talk about it and keep talking about it, keep having meetings about it. Let's do something about it, right? If we say we want to live in a just, and equitable Minneapolis, we got to make it so. We got to make it so. I have young people that come to me and say, man, I was standing on the corner and the cop just grabbed me. That's not cool. That's not cool. Not if we're living in a just society. Now, if it's a different kind of society, y'all ought to tell us. People ought to tell us what the rules are. So then we know how to conduct ourselves, right? Then if it's just an eye for an eye, then we know what to do. When the cop approaches us, we know what we got to do, right? But that's not the kind of society we're trying to live in. So if we're going to live in a just and equitable Minneapolis, I say let's repeal this ordinance. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Sophia Alaziz. And I'm sorry if I mispronounced the name.
Yeah, it's Sophia Alaziz. I'm here, my address is 1033 9th Avenue. I'm with the NAACP youth group. And I'm here to support the repeal of the lurking ordinance. This lurking ordinance has been targeting youth of color. 60% of the citations were given to African Americans, and African Americans only make up 19% of Minneapolis. And the spitting ordinance was created in 1898 for tuberculosis, and now it's being abused to just target youth of color. 15 citations were given to African Americans, and 1 was given to a white person, when white people make up the majority of Minneapolis and everyone spits. I do believe these ordinances are here to protect racist behavior by the police, and I feel Black people shouldn't be criminalized just by simply living. And we are all here to repeal this ordinance. So, thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Michael Friedman.
Thank you, Chair Yang and council members. I'm Michael Friedman. I live in the 10th Ward and recently was voted on my neighborhood board, but I'm here as the executive director of the Legal Rights Center, which is at 1611 Park Avenue South. 10 years ago, I was on the CRA board. I was on the CRA board for 4 years, and so I saw a whole bunch of private data, probably private from you. One of the cases we had was a spitting case, and it was a case where the person who was the complainant ended up in jail after the spitting. And our review panel found that there was a violation because spitting is a citation, and somehow this person ended up booked, and it didn't meet the legal grounds for booking. And the police chief overturned our decision and basically said we didn't know anything about policing. And the deputy chief, who was a person of color, also said we didn't know anything about policing, which is why issues of good cops or bad cops isn't always the matter, but how to create policy and law that works equitably. Another kind of CRA case we saw quite frequently was a case where someone made a 911 call about suspicious behavior. And then when the police officer did their job of responding to the call, the person who was being stopped and talked to, who was a person of color, was intensely angry, perceiving the situation as profiling. And I think it needs to be understood. I should also say I was at the My Brother's Keeper rollout yesterday where the mayor talked. And the mayor, one of the things she said was that in order to really change the status quo, we need to do things that can make people uncomfortable. And that would include making uncomfortable people who live in the various wards who call 911 because they're suspicious of a person of color with no other grounds. I don't like spitting, but it's certainly, the question is, does criminalizing prevent it? Of course not. Does criminalizing prevent lurking? Of course not. Does criminalizing lurking prevent burglary? Of course not, other than that if you arrested everyone who's, let's say, out in an alley for any reason or out at 1 a.m. for any reason, maybe burglaries would go down. But the point is that there is an inequitable possibility of who would get caught. And if we're going to take equity seriously in Minneapolis, then we have to remove these ordinances. State law is already a problem in lending itself toward biases. The city does not need to pile on.
Thank you. The next speaker is, and I'm sorry if I mispronounce this. Malik Cisse. Sure. Did you sign up? You did. Okay. You want to wait until you? Okay. Right. The next person is Adrienne Lowe.
Good afternoon. My name is Adrian Lowe. I currently reside in Bloomington, 9850 Del Ridge Road. I'm a current college graduate from Augsburg College. The past 4 years, I've lived in Minneapolis, in the surrounding areas of Augsburg College. But I mean, you wouldn't be able to guess that I was a college graduate by looking at me standing in a parking lot, as well as you wouldn't be able to tell that I was up to suspicious activity just because I was standing in a parking lot. I say this because a little shorter than a month ago, April 26th, it was a Sunday. I was studying for my last finals of my college career, and I was stopped. I was stopped outside of my apartment building in the parking lot looking at my car. And I live off of Franklin, and I lived in the Franklin Housing Cooperative, which is, there's a lot of areas around there like Pizza Luce, the Seward Co-op, places where, you see a lot of Caucasian people standing around, outside of these buildings, outside these places, smoking, doing whatever, what have you. And I was stopped. And I am curious for what reason. I feel that these ordinances help enforce profiling without any past evidence of, without any evidence of any wrongdoing. Because I have no police record. I just lived in Minneapolis just to go to school and come home. There was no reason that I was to be stopped. And I feel that if this is to be enforced, then it has to be fair towards all communities of the surrounding area, where you could go to Dinkytown or areas, other college campus areas where you see a lot of inebriated Caucasian people stumbling around, having their friends, carrying them home, and they aren't looked at twice. So yeah, that's a case I have to make. So I support the repeal of these ordinances. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Dua Saleh.
Hello, my name is Dua Saleh. I live at 964 Selby Avenue in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I'm here to represent Malik Cisse and what he had in mind. So Malik Cisse lives at, 1415th 8th Street Southeast, Minneapolis, Minnesota. He currently goes to Augsburg College, and he identifies as a Black youth, and he's also a member of the NAACP, St. Paul Youth and Collegiate Branch, and Save the Kids Minnesota. We need to provide better safety for our youth. The concept of lurking and spitting is literally a pointless reason to continue systemic racism and target youth of color. Not only are youth of color targeted in our communities, but also miseducated in classrooms, unable to express themselves, their forms of expression, and simply can't walk down the street and be themselves. Continuing these ordinances place our youth in constant fear, and in addition, enhance this concept that people of color are only belong in prisons. Think about that. To have these ordinances exist mean that standing, living, and just existing as a person of color means to be continuously harassed by law enforcement, and they are set to eternalize white supremacy. This is not safe for our youth. I'm here to support the appeal of these ordinances. And me, as a student that goes to Augsburg College, somebody who lives in Minneapolis, somebody who walks in Minneapolis, somebody who has fluids in their mouth that sometimes need to leave my mouth, I feel like these ordinances should not be set in place, and they're criminalizing people for no reason. I shouldn't be targeted by police officers simply for standing on the street because I'm up to no good. What is up to no good? That's a concept that stems out of racism. It's discriminatory. And continuing with these policies in Minneapolis would be a huge violation of human rights because my existence is not a crime. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Daryl Ellis. Or Dorrell Ellis?
Nah, Danzel. Danzel, how you doing? I'm Danzel Dwayne
Thank you.
Strong. I'm a resident of Ramsey County. I'm here to testify of the appeal. I'm here to testify for the repeal of the policies. Now, I was with some of my friends, at the Bar of Age when I was harassed by 6 police officers downtown Minneapolis. Now, when he approached me in a disrespectful way. So I had no choice but to ask him questions of what he was doing. So as I asked him questions, he tells me, well, I'm being disrespectful and loud, downtown Minneapolis, and he told us to leave, Our second time coming back around, he approached me, and by putting his hands on me in a way that I'm not even knowing what was going on, So he's grabbing me, and the guy tased me, So I get tased, and he didn't tell me my rights that I was going to jail. He didn't tell me why I was going to jail for. He didn't tell me anything. He put me in the squad car, and I was in Hennepin County for more than 36 hours, which I was in there for 3 days. So they let me out on Mother's Day. I'm just here to give my word in, like spitting and lurking. I mean, I look at it as it's childish. If you want to take somebody to jail, it's that way. I know for a fact that I've been saying this for a long time. I've been saying it to my friends. I've been saying it to a lot of people. It shouldn't be about race. It should be about equal. Like you shouldn't have to treat another human being a different way because of his skin color. You shouldn't have to treat nobody a different way because how they look. You're a human being. If God put you here on this earth, we all here together. So we all have to leave one way or another, but we all have to leave in a proper way, which not because I'm disrespecting you or you because of your skin color. I got a lot of friends. I got so many friends, it's the same. I look at it as America don't want to see a lot of people's success. America focus on their own and don't worry about nobody else. America is a state where it's the biggest power and the biggest weapon to America, to a European, is the black man's knowledge. And that's something that they don't want to see. And I just wanted to share that to y'all. Thank you. My name is Danzel Dwayne Strong.
Thank you. The next speaker is Kentrell Hallman.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kentrell Hallman. I'm a former student at Summit Academy studying construction and carpentry. This particular day, I was at Long Park, sits with my friends, A police car drove past. When the police car drove past, he raised down his window. He looked at us and he smiled and he kept raised back up his window and he kept moving. Next thing you know, 5 minutes later, we're surrounded by police officers on bikes yards away, cars approaching us. We felt it unsafe. They said they had probable cause. But the only thing is, how did they have probable cause when they ain't find nothing on us? They say that they had probable cause stating that we was drinking and smoking in the park. But when they approached us, they ain't found no bottle or no marijuana. But I felt, to my point of view, the only probable cause was us being young and black. They ran our name. They put up me and my friend Twan. No proper cause whatsoever. Next thing you know, they taking me, put me in handcuffs. They not reading me my rights. They not telling me why I'm going to jail for, why they're approaching us or nothing. Next thing you know, I'm in the back of the police car. They come after my friend Twan. They do the same thing. Now, they read us our rights soon as they put us in the police car. They were supposed to do it right then and there while they putting the handcuffs on us. We still was arrested. They didn't say why. They didn't give us any reasons. That's the main reason why I'm here to testify for this repeal of these policies. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. Oh, and Mr. Hallman, if I may, could you give your address for the record, please?
41 North Church Street.
Can you stand up to the microphone and do that, just so that the viewing public knows?
41 North Church Street.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The next person is kind of hard to read, but I think it's Antoine Lee.
My name is Antoine Lee, and I stay 1818 24th North. And I kind of had a similar situation, which is out with him, same thing, but I had another situation a week later. I was coming from St. Paul with a friend. We just came from like a little party, whatever. I get off the train. I'm walking up Hennepin, and an officer pulled up and said I was suspected for stealing something out of Macy's. They got a call for somebody stealing out of Macy's, and I fit the description. So he was waiting for another officer that came, and he was like, he asked the officer, was it me? And the officer clearly said no, but he said, take him anyway. So they took me up to the precinct. So I was sitting in the precinct for about an hour before another officer came in and was like, yeah, that's him. And I'm trying to figure out why I'm in here for. So they never told me what I was in for until they put me back in the cop car and was driving up to the jail cell. And I'm like, so what else I'm in here for? They said I was in here for public urination. And I'm trying to figure out public urination. I just came from St. Paul. I just got the train. I got my bus card and everything. So, and I feel like they only stopped me because I was young and black and they had nothing else better to do. And I feel like that we need to repeal these policies because, like I said, I haven't just came from St. Paul. You tell me one thing, then I go to jail for another thing, which is I haven't had nothing to do with. And I feel like that was just a racist look at it. That's how I look at it. And that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you.
Yep.
Our next speaker is Katie Hatt. And the next speaker after Ms. Hatt is Anthony Carcetti, if you can get ready.
Okay.
Hi, Ms. Hatt.
Good afternoon, Chair Yang and committee members. My name is Katie Hatz, and I live at 1417 LaSalle Avenue, apartment 301 in Ward 7. I'm here today because I strongly support the repeal of both the lurking and spitting ordinances under discussion here today. Before I came here today, I watched the public hearing from 2 weeks ago and was troubled by the comments of a leader from the Minneapolis Downtown Council who said that the repeal would be, quote, a detriment to the downtown community. With all respect to the work that the Downtown Council does to attract investment and jobs to downtown Minneapolis, I stand here today as a longtime resident of a downtown neighborhood to say that to not repeal both of these ordinances would be to the true detriment of the downtown community, where thousands of people of color who are my neighbors and colleagues work and live. As a downtown resident, I do not believe that these ordinances do anything to promote the public safety of my neighborhood or others in Minneapolis, or the livability in downtown or anywhere else in the city. Many others here today have shared tremendously personal stories that make the moral case for why action on this repeal is needed. I'd like to take a moment to share with you why I believe this is also an economic matter. After 9 consecutive years of growth, nearly 39,000 people now live in the downtown neighborhoods of Minneapolis. The Downtown Council's stated goal is to get to 70,000 residents in just the next 10 years. We are not going to grow as a city if we actively discriminate and keep ordinances on the books that disproportionately affect communities of color and continue to lead the nation in racial disparities. These tens of thousands of new residents, who I will be proud to call neighbors, will reflect the diversity of this room here today, as will population growth throughout our city that you as a city council and our mayor are very eager to attract to our city. By repealing these ordinances, the city will take first steps to reforming our criminal justice system to ensure that current and future downtown residents and residents throughout Minneapolis are treated fairly and not subject to unequal and unconstitutional treatment by our law enforcement. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hadd. And Ms. Hadd, thank you for observing the Turchic rule.
Which rule was that?
I'm kidding. Thank you. Next speaker is Anthony Carcetti.
Hello. I was going to give up my time, but the gentleman had to leave. I live at 2206 Clinton South. I just need to stand in front of you folks and say that I support the repeal of these racist laws. That's it.
Thank you. All right, that is the end of the sign-in sheets. Are there any folks who have spoken before that want to speak, that absolutely need to speak, and or anybody who hasn't signed up who wants to speak? If you do, if you can stand up, go to the microphone, that would be great.
Hello, I'm Gennaro Taylor from 2929 Chicago Avenue South, Minneapolis. I just want to read this letter that I wrote due to all of the attention that's coming to this ordinance and it's being dragged out so far. So I'm speaking to you first as a victim and for the people that are scared to speak up and for the people that can't speak up anymore. Dear Council, I, Gennaro Taylor of Minneapolis, Minnesota, I specifically am here to speak in favor for Mr. Gordon and Mr. Yang in repealing this ordinance. I come to you as a victim time and time again from the practicing of this lurking ordinance. I am a 6-time survivor of police brutality. I have a criminal record, yes. I once was a criminal, and there is no shame in that. Had I remained a criminal, would be the shame. You can't use that over my head or as a means to downplay my concerns as a steady victim of the vile injustices committed by police. I simply ask you, but she's not here, so Chair, can you tell her, Madam President and Council Member Goodman, Council Member Wright, I don't know how to pronounce it, and Council Member Quincy, Council Member Warsami, and Council Member Johnson, to please set aside personal opinions and grievances, to have an open mind and work with your fellow council members and all constituents that support repealing this ordinance that only helps to furthermore perpetuate the systematic racism. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Good afternoon. I will just speak briefly. My name is Nakima Levy-Pounds. I'm a law professor at the University of St. Thomas. I'm also the president of the Minneapolis branch of the NAACP. You all have already heard quite a bit of compelling testimony about how these ordinances continue to criminalize Blackness in the city of Minneapolis, the level of racial harassment and discrimination that occurs in the violation of people's constitutional rights. Well, I'm here today to not only ask that you repeal these low-level ordinances. Again, that's the basic level that the city should operate at. But I would ask that you all be more proactive about overhauling our entire system of policing in the city of Minneapolis. This is not just a case of a few bad officers. This is about the need for a cultural shift that needs to take place within the city, given the level of excessive force complaints that we as a people have to contend with year after year. These types of complaints and the abuse that happens leads to uprisings like what we've seen in Ferguson and Baltimore. So I would ask that not only that you repeal these two ordinances, but in the future, the near future, you look at other low-level ordinances like loitering, which is Ordinance 385.50, the ordinance that opposes three or more people congregating on a sidewalk, which is 427.220, the use of curfew violations in the city because of the way that they impact kids of color, which is 395.20, and that you also address inequities in the enforcement of marijuana laws, which have been well documented in the city of Minneapolis. It's time for a cultural shift. This is the bare minimum of what the city needs to do to promote equity. And we want to see our entire system of policing overhauled. And we want to see that begin to happen with a sense of urgency from this city council as well as the mayor. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else?
All right. So my name is Michael McDowell. I'm an organizer with Black Lives Matter Minneapolis. I stay at 3600 11th Avenue South Minneapolis. And I just wanted to uplift a lot of what Nekima said. As much as this is something that's just going to scratch the surface, overall, like this is something that plays into, you know, the overall systemic issue of, you know, people of color being, you know, historically disproportionately targeted by law enforcement. And so just uplifting what Nekima said, like, yes, this is something that's great, but we also have to, you know, push deeper and continue to work with community and figure out how we get more community control over the police, because that's essentially what's going to change this. Because like Nekima said, like this is a systemic issue. And this reminds me a lot of just the whole, this is something I just want to say, the whole New Orleans thing where, you know, a bunch of white folks got painted as, you know, just, you know, surviving and, you know, getting food for the family. And then the black folks were painted as, you know, looters and stealers and stuff like that. And it's just makes me think about, you know, how white folks and black folks get painted when it comes to, you know, specific ordinances like this. The white folks are just standing around having fun, you know, spitting drunk, like you said, carrying their friends, doing all this crazy crap. While, you know, black folks are just standing outside, hanging out, not doing anything, but they get victimized for it. So this is just a law that's playing into a lot of the narratives that cause a divide between the community and police. So it's just a step. But yeah, I support the repeal of this ordinance.
Thank you. Any other person want to come and testify?
Hi. My name is Claudio Rivera. I live at 3222 DuPont Avenue North in Ward 4. I'm here to support the repeal of lurking and spitting ordinances because racism is alive and well in Minneapolis. And not only among civilians, you know, living in the burbs, but the police that police our communities. I previously lived in Harrison and actually I was at the bus stop one time, actually got my phone stolen. But that's not the story. The story is about the responding officer who came to my home afterwards to get my story and everything. And how shocked I was when he proceeded to give me a lecture about how I shouldn't have my phone out in this neighborhood because there's a lot of black people. And that was something he said verbatim that really, really shook me. And not only that, because of how egregious, how explicitly racist that was, but because he saw me as a light-skinned person. I'm a light-skinned Latino, so I have a lot of light-skinned privileges, and I feel like he saw me as like his pal, that he could confide in me this racist garbage. And I worry that those kind of interactions are happening amongst police. I don't think this is a few bad apples. I think there's a culture, there's biases in policing, Police are supposed to protect and serve, but laws like this make it easier for them to harass and profile, putting our Black and brown brothers and sisters in danger. As people previously mentioned, this is about public safety, but it should be about the safety of everyone, including the most vulnerable amongst us. Laws like these, allow police and neighborhood associations, the people predominantly calling 911 to report suspicious people, they allow them to act on their biases, and they must be repealed. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else want to speak? Going once? You've spoken already, though. Yeah. She spoke for herself and somebody else. Yeah. Hey, I'm sorry, but that's been the case, so sorry about that. Anybody else want to speak? Right, going once? Going twice? Okay. Well, we're going to close the public hearing. If you have any more comments, you can feel free to send those comments to your council member, and it will be distributed to other council members, or send it to the city clerk. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank everybody for coming and for the testimony and sharing your stories and sharing your thoughts. This is the repeal of the lurking ordinance is something I tried to accomplish back in 2008, and we weren't successful. Some of the same people are here, but there's also many new people here. And it's made me reflect a little bit at how the world, the council, the community, things are very different than they were back then. 2008 was before Michelle Alexander wrote her famous book that I recommend everybody read called The New Jim Crow, which really lays out the case carefully for how we transitioned from the pre-60s era of how we were a racist country to the how we are now. How much more subtle it got, how it was connected to the war on drugs, how the whole stop and frisk is connected to that, low-level offenses are, how certain laws were written as part of that, vagrancy laws that we heard about today, and I think lurking laws and other laws were written really as a way of controlling people based on their race or their economic status, and this is very much about economic status. This time when we're talking about this, I think people's minds are opened further than they were in 2008. They're ready to listen more and people understand it more. I was actually struck by the comment, and I don't know if the woman's here, but just talked about how there's two parallel cities that are going on. I don't think people believed it or understood it as much in 2008 as they do now, hopefully, it sounds like. And one of the reasons they are is because people are willing to kind of share those stories. And I think most of the people in Ward 2, even though we had somebody from Ward 2 talking about how this doesn't happen on University Avenue. Well, most of the people who live there don't want it to happen anywhere. And when they start to understand the different feelings that some of the citizens in Minneapolis have when they see a police car go by or approach them, they don't want to see that. I have gotten very little pushback from my constituents in the Second Ward about this, and mostly encouragement, and that's across all racial lines. We need to do this and we need to address it. That's a big it with a capital I and a capital T, because that's not the lurking and the spitting. So I have to confess to you, the lurking and the spitting aren't that significant of a problem in and of themselves. And I think that's the lesson that we're getting here. In fact, repealing laws or not repealing laws probably isn't going to make the change happen that we need to make happen. But telling these stories is, and having these conversations. I'm convinced that the structural racism is so complex and it's so deeply embedded from top to bottom that it's going to take a surgical precision knife, and it's going to take broad brush strokes. Those are mixing my metaphors, but you know what I mean. And across the criminal justice system and beyond. One of the interesting things that we've started looking at now is, well, who's actually reporting suspicious activity and what are they thinking about when they're doing it? And we're talking more about unintentional bias and trying to raise that up. And let's all think about where's this coming from when we're making these decisions and doing these things. And this is so little about the police alone. Obviously, has to be a culture shift in the police department, but there has to be a culture shift much bigger than that. And it's important that we're focused right now, I think, on these two ordinances. I'm hopeful that we're going to have this recommendation that I'm going to move, that these will be supported unanimously at this committee. And I'm actually hopeful that they'll be unanimous at the full council. And in large measure, that's because of the community that's gotten involved, that came forward and said, please do this, try this again. We can do this now. This is important to us. This is significant. We recognize this is an important step to take. And I appreciate that. After the 5th, when I still have my, I guess, optimism that we'll have a 13-0 vote, I think it's possible on both of the repeal of these. Then I think we can look at what we can do next and where we proceed there and what's going to make the most sense. But I think it's really important that we can look at that together. We've demonstrated a little bit here, I think, that there can be a pretty unique partnership between the representatives in City Hall and the community, and I hope that we can keep building on that and moving forward. And you hopefully have also heard that there are some people who are worried. We've heard about a slippery slope or what's going to happen, public safety. How are we going to, make sure that we have a livable, healthy downtown? And as strange as that might seem, those are the things that we can also work with and address, and we can talk about them and we can look at it, because absolutely we want everybody to be safe. We want a livable downtown. We want it to be great. And we can address those concerns maybe in more proactive ways, but let's keep the dialogue going.
Councilmember Gordon, why don't you do the honors?
All right. And well, can I make my motion first?
Yeah,
or do you want to
we'll have the
speak first?
discussion.
Yeah. So I may as well make the formal motion that I move forward with recommending the repeal of both of these ordinances.
Okay, thank you. And discussion, Councilmember Warsame.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to Councilmember Gordon for bringing these two items to our attention. And I know he tried in 2008, but we have a different council now, and I think that this one is a no-brainer. I'm not too sure why there was why there was doubt from members of the community that the council, especially this committee and this council, would be, against repealing these two ordinances. The public testimony speaks for itself. The people who came here, the two last public hearings, I was counting, and I think 97% to 3% who were for repealing these ordinances. And also the emails that we got, the telephone conversations, the conversations in the community. Like I said, this is a no-brainer. I'm in support of this, and I was in support of this from the beginning when I heard. I didn't even know that spitting was actually a crime in the city of Minneapolis, and so part of my ignorance. And so we learn something every day. And where I live, and I heard a couple of testimonies today that was kind of alarming from Augsburg College students, and that's where I live, that's where I work, and that's an area that me and Council Gordon represent. And it's alarming that young students just going about their everyday lives are being stopped and harassed. And that's something we need to look into as well. In terms of the overall building trust between the public and the community, I think that's something, police and the community, I think that's something that we need to work on. But another thing is we do need to diversify the police force. So we need members from the African-American community, young members, to join the police force, because that's how you're going to have change. When you're in the system, you're going to have a lot more change than when you're outside. So I think we need to join it. I think we need to change some of these laws. In terms of these two right now, I'm supporting it. And I thank Councilmember Gordon and Councilmember Yang for bringing this up. And I thank the community for coming and the testimony that you've given us. I've been stopped for lurking. When I was working, I remember a time when I was working in Roseville and working for Wells Fargo. And I went and bought a salad, and I had it in my bag, and I was walking, and the police officer stopped me, and I had headphones on, listening to music, and I couldn't hear what she was saying. And I tried to put my hand up, and she was very threatening. And another police officer came, and they stopped me, and they said, "What do you have in the bag?" And there was a Best Buy where I was walking around. They said, "Oh, there was a 6-foot African American gentleman with a hoodie. And it's, Minnesota weather and how cold it gets. And I told the police officer, can I get this thing out of my ears? He said, what are you doing? I can't hear you. Okay. And after the interaction, he said, what do you have in the bag? And I said, I have a Boston market salad in the bag. And they put his hand in the bag and he saw it. He said, okay. Where are you going? To the bus stop. Do you want us to give you a lift? I said, thank you, officer. You've been helpful enough today. So, and I walked to so I understand, and I think that we need to build confidence in this city that residents of the city and the residents of the Twin Cities can travel wherever they want. They can go wherever they want, and they shouldn't feel threatened, and they shouldn't feel out of place. So again, thank you, council members, for this, and I'll be supporting this motion.
Thank you. Councilmember Bender, you get a comment. You've been listening intently, even though you're not a part of this committee, so feel free.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I came today and the previous hearing as well, and I don't sit on the committee and can make my remarks at council, but just want to thank you for having me. And also, I'm here to show my support. I think that the voices and the stories that people have been telling through these hearings are so important, not just for these two, what should be very simple, obvious changes, but to build and change the narrative, because we should all be talking about how to protect the safety and the lives of the people sitting in this room, of the people of color in our communities. And that's what your stories are here today, I think, building that case. And I don't know how it feels to stand up and tell those stories, but I want you to know how important it is and how much it matters to shifting the dialogue away from maybe we can't even make these two simple changes to transforming the way that we work together with communities of color to protect and build up and empower everyone in our city. So I appreciate so much the time that people came and took to share your personal stories today.
Thank you. Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be really brief. I also will be supporting the repeal of these ordinances. I see this particularly. What is particularly provoking to me is that this is considered a livability issue, and I think somebody else said it well here today. Livability, but for whom? That it might do worse than its goal of achieving public safety is a dangerous precedent to set. Absolutely, this is a racial justice issue, and I look forward to the OJP outcomes of the committees that I know that many of you here in the audience sit on, and I sit on a committee too for the OJP police reform programs. This affects homeless people as well, of homeless people everywhere in our city as well. I thought it was particularly thought-provoking that a little girl in the front row who had to leave with her mother, I presume, I guess she was 3 or 4, she said, "Justice is life." And I couldn't help but think that I know that that's why we all are here today. Everybody here in this room and everybody here elected behind this dais. So thank you for everybody's testimony today. That's all I have to say.
Councilmember Warsan? No. Councilmember Gordon?
I just forgot to say one thing. People raised a lot of good issues in this. Standing is not a crime, but I was really struck by somebody who said my existence is not a crime, and it's not. And what I was struck with today, especially the young people who came up, the young men, the young women who came up and spoke, is that how much your existence is actually a great and awesome gift to us as a city and to our community. And that's the message you should get from your city council and from your government and from your community. So thank you very much.
Anybody else? If there's nobody else, I'm going to make the final comments and then we'll take a vote on this. First and foremost, I think sometimes people frame this conversation as, Councilmember Gordon and Councilmember Yang have decided to give people license to spit and to lurk, and that is not the case. That is absolutely not the case. I think with regards to spitting, it's pretty simple, really. I've used other language in other places, but I will choose my language carefully today. I just think that the spitting ordinance is outdated. It's time to just go. The lurking ordinance, I think what's compelling about the lurking ordinance is exactly what was said earlier by the chair of the ACLU. which is this, that there's no guidance on what lurking truly is. And so in some ways, you can really lurk if you don't have criminal intent, but who the heck knows what that means? That's the thing. And so we have to give direction, with our laws to make it very clear. And I think in that situation, I think both the lurking and spitting ordinances, deserve to go. And it's time for us to repeal them. And so, I'm happy to support the repeal of both ordinances, and I pray that we will be able to pass it as a council. The final vote on this would be June the 5th, which is a Friday. I encourage you all to feel free to come on that day. I can tell you all that if you do come on that day, you will not have a chance to speak, because at the full council, the council members get to speak, and we discuss our business there. And so just to let you know that that would be the case. But I'm hopeful. But I won't say exactly what Councilmember Gordon said, which is it's going to be a unanimous vote. But I certainly think hopefully we will get a good vote, and if we get 7-6, I'd be happy even. So I will say that. But thank you all so much for being here, for being a part of this conversation. I look forward to seeing how it turns out on the 5th. And thank you so much. So council members, the motion's on the table to repeal both of these ordinances, and this would be a recommendation to the full council. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, the motion carries. Thank you. And thank you all for being here. With no further business before this committee, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.